We're going to move on to item B. The clerk.
Item 7B, discuss and provide direction regarding an urgency ordinance establishing a temporary moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent by small business commercial tenants directly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic.
City Attorney.
Mr. Mayor, I apologize in advance for having to listen to me twice tonight. 2 doses of the city attorney is more than most city councils can take. So
it's okay, you were kind of quiet the last council meeting, so this makes up.
If you just give us a second, we'll try to get the document up on the screen. Hold on. All right, is everybody able to see that?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so our last conduct of business topic is discussion and direction regarding commercial eviction urgency ordinance. So here's our agenda. We have a little background. We're going to talk about the policy rationale for such an ordinance, briefly discuss the legal basis, and then talk about some of the different provisions that such an ordinance might include, and then end with next steps. So as you know, on March 16th of this year, there was a shelter-in-place order and an emergency proclamation by both the county and the city of San Bruno. And on that same date, the governor issued an order authorizing local jurisdictions to adopt residential and commercial moratoria on evictions. And so that was an authorization. It wasn't a requirement to do so. The state left it up to individual entities such as cities and counties. So on the 23rd of March, the county did adopt a moratorium on residential evictions covering the entire county. So in other words, all residential evictions everywhere in the county, cities or unincorporated areas are now covered by that moratorium. And I believe that the Board of Supervisors also just recently enacted, with respect to that particular moratorium, a rent freeze. And I'm sorry, I don't have all the details of that at hand, but that's an action that the Board of Supervisors recently took, if memory serves. On April 7th, the Board of Supervisors adopted a moratorium on commercial evictions, but covering only the unincorporated areas. So in this one, unlike the residential eviction ordinance, they chose not to include all of the cities in the order. So it only covers unincorporated areas. So let's talk a little bit about what the policy rationales for such an ordinance might be. I think the first one is obvious. We're currently in a pandemic resulting in a severe and unprecedented economic and social dislocation. So in cities and the county do have a public interest in small businesses remaining open because those businesses provide essential services. So that's important, and that's good for the public health, safety, and welfare, which is a reason that you can adopt one of these ordinances if you so desire. But there's also a public interest in other small businesses that are not currently open, allowing them to reopen or putting them in a financial position where they might be able to reopen when it's allowed. And again, that's a strong public interest. There are a couple of other considerations that came up regarding the discussion of such an ordinance. And so one consideration is that commercial tenants and landlords may be in a more equal bargaining position than their residential counterparts. Another issue that was raised is that some landlords might actually qualify as small businesses. So in other words, you have a small business tenant, but you might also have a small business landlord. And so that's just something to consider in terms of each individual community. And then finally, the other thing to keep in mind is that the courts are basically closed to eviction cases. They're not going to be hearing any of them until 90 days after the shelter order is lifted by the governor. So there will not actually be any evictions at the earliest until 90 days after the shelter-in-place order is lifted. and actually quite a bit after that, because what happens on day 91 is that the lawsuit can actually be served, and then there's time to answer, could be discovery, there's all kinds of things. So lawsuits regarding commercial evictions are unlikely to proceed any time in the near future. So what would be the legal basis for an ordinance prohibiting commercial evictions at this time? Well, the government code does give you the opportunity to adopt an urgency ordinance, protect the public peace, health, safety, and welfare. That's very general. But for an urgency ordinance, you really need some detailed factual findings. And you'll see those factual findings in a variety of expressions in both the county ordinance and in the city ordinances that have been adopted that I attached to your staff report. The good news about those findings is that the courts will generally defer to the city council's findings. So if the city council says something is an urgent problem, the courts usually aren't going to second guess that, unless there is some sort of overriding either a constitutional or other state law issue that the court identifies. Urgency ordinances, which are adopted at one meeting, you don't need two readings like most other ordinances, do require a 4/5 vote of the council. So we're not asking you to vote on anything tonight, but we are looking for some direction about whether you're interested in adopting such an ordinance. So let's talk just for a few minutes about what such an ordinance might contain. And the basic goal of the ordinance is to prohibit steps being taken toward commercial evictions. Well, what does that mean? And so normally that means that before you can evict a tenant, you have to send them a notice. It's either a 3-day notice, pay or quit, or it's a 30-day notice if that's what's allowed by the lease. It says that we want to evict you based on either non-payment of rent or for some other reason. So what these ordinances do that the county and other cities have adopted is they say that if the tenant can't pay for a reason that's directly related to COVID-19 conditions, then the ordinance prohibits the landlord from evicting them under certain circumstances. And so you'll see if you look at the ordinances that there's sort of a large number of conditions that might qualify for this. Loss of income, gross receipts, medical bills and expenses. Maybe the business was closed. Obviously, that's going to be a problem. But it has to be related to COVID-19. It can't just be the business was failing before and now it's really failed. And it's not related to COVID-19. And so what this requires, or what these ordinances uniformly require, is the landlord, before they serve any sort of notice, they have to give notice to the tenant that this ordinance exists. And the city or the county would come up with a form for that. And it requires the tenant to document the loss in income or other conditions that are related to COVID-19. So the rent isn't forgiven, it still remains due, and it remains due, however, after the ordinance expires. And all of the ordinances that we've got for you this evening, they all expire on May 31st. And I think that date was selected as the current outside date of when the shelter-in-place orders might be in effect. It's certainly possible they would be extended. And you could extend this ordinance as well if you wanted to, or re-adopt a new one. But the ones that are in your packet are all expire on the 31st. So these are the provisions that are essentially common to all ordinances. So what are some of the differences in the ordinances? Well, let's talk about those. Well, the first question is, what's the definition of a small business? And it's a small business who gets the benefit of the ordinance. So there's a couple of different definitions. There's 3 of them, actually. So the county and Menlo Park and Pacifica say that if you have gross receipts of less than $2.5 million, you're a small business. And the basis for that was because that is the same definition of a small business used by SAMCETA, apparently in the grant or loan programs that they're facilitating. Millbrae decided to say to cover businesses that have gross receipts of up to $5 million. So obviously that would cover more businesses than if it was $2.5 million. And the cities of San Mateo and South San Francisco said 25 million, again, obviously covering quite a bit many more businesses. So the question for San Bruno is, what's the right number? And that's a policy decision for you. And so we did a little research. Thank you to the finance department. We've got about 2,900 businesses that pay a business license tax, and a little over 4% have gross receipts of more than 5 million. A little over 7%, the numbers in parentheses are the actual numbers. About 7% have gross receipts of 2.5 to 5, and 16% have gross receipts between 1 and 2.5. So basically what that means is if you said everybody under 2.5 million gross receipts is a small business, you would capture everyone below that threshold. So in other words, it would be the 7.1, the 16%, and then everybody that's less than $1 million, which is quite a few of our businesses, as you can tell. So that's one policy decision for the city to make. And don't worry, we'll summarize these at the end, so you don't have to keep them in mind. So the next question is, what's the date that the ordinance is effective? And most of them have made it the date of adoption. But there is an option that we've discussed where the ordinance could be made retroactive to the date of non-expired notices of eviction. So for example, if I'm a tenant and I've already received a notice of eviction, but it hasn't expired yet, the ordinance could be made applicable to them. All right, what are the other issues that we might want to look at? So the next question is, how much time do you have to pay after the ordinance expires? And again, we have a little variation. Pacifica said basically 90 days. And the other said a total of 180 days, 180, but some of them in increments. So in other words, you get 90 up front and then you get 30-day increments as long as you can prove that you're still having a problem. So that's a policy decision for the city council. You want to go for a shorter amount and then provide increments, or do you want to just say 180 days or something in between? Another policy question is whether the ordinance should have a hardship waiver for the landlord. What does that mean? And what that's referring to is if the landlord can come in and say, wait a second, you know, maybe I'm a small business too, and if I don't get this rent, I'm going to go out of business. And that's a waiver that the city manager in these ordinances would be allowed to grant. And the county and South San Francisco, the city of South City, said, no, we're not going to put that in the ordinance. And the others did. And I asked, well, why was that? And one of the reasons is because having that waiver allows the city to better defend the ordinance. In other words, there's a safety valve. And one of the things we like to do as lawyers is always create a safety valve so that way there's some discretion that can be exercised in an unusual case. And then the final topic of discussion and direction is whether you want to include an option for the city to enforce the ordinance. And Pacifica said, no, we'll allow that to the private parties. And the other said, yes, we'll allow an option of city enforcement. I think it's an open question about how the city would enforce it. It would be difficult and somewhat intrusive because the city's getting involved in the commercial relationships between commercial landlords and tenants. So it's not clear that we're really set up to do that, but most cities did include the option, at least, of city enforcement, which is not to say they're going to enforce it. So here's a summary of the questions for tonight. Do you want to have an expiration date of the 31st? Everybody does. What's your definition of a small business? Should it be $1 million, 2.5, 25 million? What should be the effective date of the ordinance? Either when it's adopted or retroactive to the date of unexpired notices. What should the time to pay be? Up to 6 months after the order is lifted or in increments. Landlord hardship waiver, and then finally the option for city enforcement. So I'll leave this slide up, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions from colleagues? Anyone?
Mr. Mayor?
Marty, thank you.
Yeah. City Attorney, could you discuss like the risk in these different options that we have here? Just kind of go through them and just kind of make us feel a little more certain on how much trouble we can get into? or stay out of?
Yeah. So the one thing that will probably mitigate your risk the most is to include a hardship waiver for the landlord, to include that provision. It's not really clear to me why other cities didn't include it. I know there are a couple of other cities that are either deciding or have decided in the last day or two, and I don't have that information. But that's important because that means that it's harder for a landlord to do what's called a facial challenge to the ordinance. In other words, the ordinance on its face is somehow illegal or unconstitutional. So that's generally not going to be the case in discretionary approval that the city or exception that the city can make. In terms of the legal risk overall, I think the county recognized some additional legal risk. It's probably why they didn't apply it to the whole county like they did the residential ordinance. And that legal risk comes from the fact that the residential eviction ordinance is directly related to the shelter in place order. So if you're evicted from your house, well, you can't shelter in place. So now you're in a catch-22, you're violating the order. Whereas a commercial eviction, presumably those folks have a place to live, they're not really violating the order. So I think they looked at that and thought, well, if you're the county, you can take on the first risk. They didn't want to take on the second one. Having said that, most cities on the peninsula are either considering or have adopted this.
Mayor Medina, can we get a input from the community? I think there's a question up there.
Let me see. Melissa, do you see?
Yes, I do. Mark, I'm gonna take away your screen sharing for the moment.
Okay.
And then, Mr. Seymour, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
We can hear you.
Sometimes I think it's just me and you guys. So, anyways, we have a whole city of 45,000 people, so it would be nice if others contributed. But so the best I understand here is this is for commercial, but I also think we need to talk about residential, and I'll leave that aside. You guys can discuss that. On the small business, I would say it would be anything below 2.5 million, and that's without the credentials or knowledge to suggest that, but just based on the information that was just given. Time to pay, I think once we get through this, it's unreasonable to ask people to pay within 30 or 90 days. I mean, they haven't made any money. The 180 is even an issue. And I'd like to think that we're a community of commercial entrepreneurs and business folks who might forgive those who can forgive the fact that the payment would even need to be made. Landlord hardship, I agree with that. I think there are a lot of landlords out there who are in the same position that their tenants are. So you need to work that into the situation. In city enforcement, I think that, I'm not a lawyer. I'm sending my daughter to law school so that she can give me some pointers. But I would think that that's something that needs to be left up to the legal system to address. But I do think that this is an important issue that we need to talk about as a community, because if we're going to come through this in a way with the least amount of damage, then we need to work together as a community, both as landlords and tenants, both in the commercial and residential sector. And I think that we're a small town, so I have a lot of optimism in what we can do together, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you can all craft to help make that happen. And those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Is there anybody else, Melissa?
No, I don't see anybody at this time. No.
Okay. All right. So why don't we bring it to council for comments or thoughts, course, the city attorney is looking for some direction on some of the items he brought up.
Can Mark share his screen again, please, with the list of items? Please.
Mark, can you share your screen, please? With a list of items we're being asked. And then Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Mark and staff for bringing this item forward. I think that as a council, everybody has expressed concern over our small business community and how we can help. And as COVID-19 has really evolved and paralyzed our economy here in San Bruno, it's been really hard to figure out how we're going to help small businesses because other cities, I believe Burlingame, practically overnight was able to come up with over $500,000 to help with their small business community. So I think this is one way that we can help our small business community because we don't have the money that other cities have. And I think this is really an appropriate step for government to come in and really help its small business community. We're not taking anything from the landlords. We're going to ensure that landlords get paid. We're not requiring, anything to not be paid. We're just saying, hey, we need to give our small businesses an opportunity to get back on their feet. So with that said, I would advocate for a 180-day period. I would advocate for the small business definition to be, I didn't write it down, Mark, but you had a slide where you actually laid out all the different small business allocations. So maybe we can go back to that, but let me go down the rest of this list. Oh, go ahead.
There you go.
Okay, great, thank you. So, yeah, I would go, I would actually honestly go all the way to the 5 million and under, to be quite honest, because everything is just so expensive in the Bay Area. And then and then I'm sorry, Mark, if you could go back to your checklist again, just so I hit all of your. Okay. Effective date, I think it should be retroactive. This caught a lot of people by surprise, the COVID-19 shelter in place, so retroactive to the date that the declaration of emergency was also retroactively placed by resolution. Time to pay, 180 days. Landlord hardship waiver, yes, I think a landlord should have a hardship waiver. And then the option of the city enforcement, I don't think the city should be the enforcement branch for this particular this direction that we hopefully will take. So hopefully that provides you some additional instruction, Mark. I think, but I think this is great, and I really think that our small business community, many, just so everyone knows, I'm not sure what conversations council's had, but I've spoken to a number of business owners, and none of them have gotten a break on their rent. So I think it's really important that we help them, especially those that are not considered essential right now and are closed but are still being asked to pay their rent. I think it's important that we really stand up for them. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Linda. Laura?
Thank you. Hey, great comment, Linda. I think you bring up an excellent point with, a city like Burlingame, we just don't have the resources to support our small businesses. And I think this is definitely needed. I was actually willing to support all of your actions, Linda. I was going to say up to 2.5 million, but I'm willing to support up to 5 million. I mean, I can't imagine to be a small business owner, a family owned a business for many, many years, and to close the front doors for so many months is just devastating. And so what we can do to how we can help out, I'm also all in supportive. So ditto Mike Bruno's comments.
Michael or Marty?
Yeah, I agree. This is going to be very difficult for people to get out of this hole. I mean, there's no forgiveness of loans or of any kind. It's looking pretty bleak. Hearing from Jackie Spears' comments at a conference call about the number of restaurants that are likely not to reopen in the 50% range, and that's really, really scary. And will have consequences in all across California. So I'm in support of all of this. The $5 million is fine, and everything else that Linda said, that was fine. I'm fine with that.
Michael?
Yeah, I'm also in favor. I believe the $5 million is probably a good place to be. That still only covers about a quarter of the businesses, according to these statistics on the slide. I mean, it is potentially shifting this burden onto a different group of people, and I mean, I think that the hardship waiver is necessary because we are shifting that burden, and I wouldn't say that it's without risk, because if we're basically preventing these people to make business decisions for up to 6 months, and some of these businesses don't come back, they may never get paid, and so they're out 6 months rent. So I wouldn't say that it's not without any risk to the landlord. So I believe the hardship waiver may allow them some way out of this, given that the state has already decided that their protection is going to extend 90 days past the shelter-in-place order, which is as yet undefined. That number could, it could go on for a while, but if we can define a process where, that there is a system in place for them to pay it back, and that they have some recourses, and we can help them out in some way, I think it is the right thing to do. In terms of city enforcement, Mark, you said that the other cities are going to provide some sort of enforcement, but maybe can you explain a little bit more about what that might look like for us? I mean, I know we're definitely not equipped to do that now, but do you have any indication about what the other cities are going to do, and if there's anything that we could do to emulate what they're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that I don't think any of the cities said that they're going to enforce it. What they've done is they just included the standard provisions in their ordinances that say the city is authorized to enforce. So they're not promising to enforce it. They're just saying they're authorized to do that. Whereas the Pacifica omitted that from their ordinance. And so that's how we concluded they're not going to be enforcing it, because it doesn't say they're authorized to. So, and then I did want to just make one other comment, if I might. I wanted to clarify something, and it may have been my error in the presentation. So the gross receipts of 5 million and below, that's actually going to cover about 95% of the businesses in the city, because only 4.4% of businesses in the city have gross receipts of more than $5 million. So at the $5 million level, you're covering pretty much just about everyone.
I see. So the percentages in that slide, what do those represent?
So I'm sorry, it's sort of the opposite of how the ordinances are written, but that's the data that we had. So with those, the percentages represented the businesses that are making more than that particular number. So the way our business license tax works is that if it's up to a certain amount, you pay X. If it's between X and Y, then you pay more. If it's between Y and Z, then you pay more. And those thresholds are $1 million, 2.5, and 5 million. So the only people over $5 million are 128 businesses, 4.4%.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, so therefore, if the threshold, let's just say for sake of argument, were 2.5 million, that would be not including about 12% of the businesses, but you would be including everybody other than those 12%. So it's 88% at 2.5 million, and about 96% at 5 million.
So the 5 million mark includes pretty much everyone.
Just about.
Just about. Okay. All right. Fair enough.
Any other thing else, Michael?
No. I think that covers it.
Marty, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Do we? I was contacted by one business owner that received an eviction notice. Does the city have any additional numbers of businesses that have called asking about this ordinance or have expressed any interest in pursuing with this ordinance?
So the city manager is indicating, no, we have not, as far as we know. And we also did check with the community development department, and my understanding is they have not as well.
Okay, thank you.
And then for me, it seems like we're pretty much all on the same page. You know, and this is something that when the San Mateo County mayors met with the county and they established a global coverage for the whole county when they took action in regards to residential. As they took action this morning, which is a little off the topic, but they did a residential freeze on a moratorium on rent increases, but that will cover the whole county. So that's already been enacted as of today's action by the Board of Supervisors. But what they didn't want to do by their legal counsel was take on this topic. They were willing to do it for the unincorporated areas, but not for the rest of the county. And that was their legal counsel saying that there was risk, that they didn't want to blanket us. So I think the risk is at this point, because the courts are closed and everything else, nominal. But I think it's significant and important enough that we need to also do what we can. It is just something I've always told people, you know, as we welcomed in 220, could we ever imagine we'd be sitting here going through this today? Nothing that we had thought of. But it sounds like we're, Mark, from my knowledge, is that we're talking 180 days. We're talking up to 5 million gross receipts. We're talking retro back to the emergency. We're talking a landlord waiver. And to go back to the emergency, does that give us any more risk or problem for us as a city than it would if it wasn't retro?
I think it's slightly more risk than what I indicated in my presentation. So what I was talking about in my presentation is retroactivity to the date of any unexpired notice of eviction. So that may or may not be back to the effective date of the shelter-in-place order. So for example, if I got a notice of eviction 2 weeks before the shelter-in-place order, there was a 30-day notice, well, that's already expired. And so that eviction was occurring beforehand. So I was not necessarily recommending, although it's a policy decision for you, that this reach back that far. I was recommending that it reach back to the point of any notices of eviction that have not yet expired. In other words, the small business owner got a notice and it's still within that 30-day period, or it's within some extension of that.
Okay, so I guess that's the only thing I am trying to get a better handle on, because obviously we're willing to assume some risk, but I mean you're trying to quantify that type of risk level.
Yeah, it is a little riskier to go back to the shelter-in-place order. On the other hand, that was only March 16th. It's hard to believe it was only 6 weeks ago. So you're really only taking on another 2 weeks of risk in that situation. So. Okay.
Well then, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, so Mark, do you feel that you have enough feedback from council?
I do. I actually have one other question on the 180 days. Is that something that the city council wants to do in increments? You know, most of the cities did 90 and then, 90 for sure. And then you get 3 30-day extensions if you can prove that you're still having a problem. Is that the intent, or are you interested in just doing 180 days right out of the gate?
Oh, so maybe do 90 days and then you're saying do 30-day extensions, which,
I think that's what most of the other cities did that so that there is some discretion there. And so that you're not telling landlords, okay, you're not going to get paid for 6 months no matter what.
yeah, and I know the county is doing the 30 days with the review on the residential rent increases because of state law and the governor's and all of that. But I am in favor of the 90 days with the 30-day extension because obviously we don't know where it's going, what have you. So I'm okay with that as well. So that's just my thought.
I agree.
I agree.
Okay, very good.
Agreed.
Okay.
All right,
Oh, sorry.
We'll bring
Just
that
one
back at the
thing.
next meeting.
Just one thing to think about, the city attorney, is if we do the 90 days and then we add the 30 days, does that then trigger the city to notice everybody every 30 days of the extension?
Good question. No, that would be the landlord's responsibility.
To notify the tenants.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll confirm that, but I think that's the case.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else, Mark?
That'll do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.